Happy New Year, and welcome to Our State of Education, sponsored by the Skillman Foundation and hosted by its president and CEO, Angelique Power. Our State of Education is a monthly conversation where students and teachers, parents, and policymakers come together to talk about great developments happening in our schools, what needs to be improved, and how we can all work together to support Michigan kids. Angelique, what's on tap for today's show?
Happy New Year, Lloyd. Today, we are going to look back on 2025. We're going to look at all of the things that have changed in education policy last year. And spoiler alert, there was a whole heck of a lot that changed. And then we're going to look forward at 2026, the year ahead, and see what's possible now. We have two soothsayers that are joining us, one national, one local, and they're going to read the tea leaves and tell us what's happening for the country and what's going to happen in Michigan. Stay tuned for that.
So whether you're in Detroit or the UP, a parent or a policymaker, this conversation is for you. This is Our State of Education on 760 WJR. Now, to guide us into today's conversation, here's your host, Skillman President and CEO, Angelique Power.
Hello, dear listeners. We are at the start of a new year, and not just any year. 2026 is a consequential year. Nationally, it's the 250th anniversary, the semi-quincentennial. On July 4th, our nation will celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Since 1776, America has stood for the pursuit of universal rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The foundation of this aspiration, the promise we make to one another, is the right to be educated. In the 1800s, our nation developed a public education system, creating free, tax-supported schools. Not just because this was good for the individual, but because it was good for our communities and the nation as a whole. Over the decades, many reforms have happened to make schools accessible for all children, including the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision that outlawed racial segregation in schools, and a 1975 act that mandated education be provided to students with disabilities. There are also constant reforms happening to update and upgrade schools, and not every reform is effective or positive. Public education, like democracy itself, is a perpetual project, one that needs our steadfast commitment and examination. Our first guest will give us an examination of what happened in 2025, the good and the not so good, and what is now on the horizon. Bethany Little, welcome. Let me tell you all a little bit about Bethany. She is the managing principal at EducationCounsel, dedicated to improving education in the United States. EdCounsel brings best practices, identifies really big ideas and opportunities, engages a wide diversity of people and partners to lead change together, and through this work has helped strengthen education systems across the U.S. Bethany has spent 20 years working as an education advocate, including on the White House Domestic Policy Council and at the United States Department of Education. In the U.S. Senate, she served as Chief Education Counsel to the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. She was Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at the Alliance for Excellent Education and the Director of Government Relations for the Children's Defense Fund. Welcome to the show, Bethany.
Thank you so much, Angelique. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So much has happened on the federal level in 2025. Can you just give us, what are the headlines of what happened last year?
2025 was an unanticipated year in education. It was an unprecedented year in education. I think the good news is the things that have happened have not been unstoppable, because a lot of what happened in 2025, in the perspective of EducationCounsel, which comes to this from a lens of really wanting the success of all children, really addressing some of the marginalizations and historic and current problems that have been caused, some of which you referenced early on. This was not a great year in terms of moving forward for a lot of students. there was a lot of attempt to roll back protections for students, opportunities for young people in their communities. Really specifically, we saw an unbelievable sort of pullback of dollars and commitment in civil rights and the civil rights infrastructure, protections for students with disabilities, work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is important and legal in this country, was deemed and declared illegal unilaterally, and sort of people pushed away from that. A big rollback of data and research, massive cancellation, billions of dollars worth of education research projects across the country stopped in their tracks. And often with a loss of the work that had been done to date, attempts to sort of erase data, take down data collections that people rely on for advocacy and policy making. Big shifts in funding, federal funding streams that people had counted on and expected, they were told would disappear. Grants that had been given for certain purposes like mental health, supports for students, or professional development for teachers simply pulled back. And really norms changed. Things that people had come to expect to be normal in education, like if you were given a 5-year grant, you would get 5 years worth of money. Or if there was a peer review process that would say these are grants that are worthwhile and meet the criteria for investment, that peer review might be subjugated to a political review, and real shifts really coming mostly from the federal level. Even though a lot of this had started years earlier with pushback in certain states, the incoming Trump administration took over the national education dialogue and has driven incredible change this year.
In many ways, I'm listening to you and thinking that in many ways it was sort of like a bulldozer across what had been before, the philosophy of the role of the federal government, that what they do, how they play a role around the states, that was sort of bulldozed, stopped in its tracks. What does that mean for Michigan? And this just not even, we're going to talk about what opportunities come, but what did the bulldozing of existing things, how would we have felt that here?
Yeah. It's absolutely right. The history of the federal involvement in education really has always been about expanding access and opportunity, ensuring that places, people who are not getting the education that they needed, the education that they had the right to, that changed over time. And this year we did see this sort of change in the posture of the federal government, and that resonates and plays into what's happened in Michigan. We saw risk to students and communities, particularly through things like fear of students who are of different immigration statuses, including mixed immigration statuses and with their families, to go to school at all. We saw students staying home at a moment when the country was experiencing an unbelievable surge in absenteeism, chronic absenteeism, as a major educational challenge. This pushed more students further away from school as a place that they were safe and that they went to learn. That was a big shift. We saw a big rollback in the support of students with disabilities in terms of confidence that their civil rights would be enforced. The vast majority of civil rights enforcement for students with disability takes place from the federal level. And so suddenly when that backstop is pulled away, there's less confidence by those parents, even by districts and states that are not sure anymore who to go to be that arbiter, to be that decider of what is the civil rights enforcement. The loss of funds was quite real. Mental health grants, funds for minority serving institutions at the higher education level really stop folks in their tracks from feeling like higher education was for them. It was a goal that they could pursue, that they would have access to campuses where they would be included, where opportunities would be given to them. That shift in mindset and policy really resonates down into what people expect. But at the same time, we have to recognize that people in Michigan have been asking, okay, wait a minute. We have our own values and our own priorities, and we are not simply driven by what happens at the federal level. So while all of this bulldozing was coming at the state also came together, and there was a budget passed. There were good decisions made on behalf of the state's children. And so it is both a time of risk and of opportunity.
That's absolutely true. I think the last point you're making, we think about at Skillman a lot, that we will support the need for public systems forever, because we know that is really how the average citizen has access to the American dream, is they can tap into public systems of support. Certainly our public education system has evidence to show that if you go through and you receive quality education, you will be able to get jobs, strong jobs, get health insurance, you have better health outcomes, like it's connected to all of those things. I'm curious when we come back, if we could talk a little bit more about the opportunities. So whenever you bulldoze, you kind of razz the ground and you clear the way for something new. And you've been working on some of that with us. Let us know when we come back what some of those things are.
And that's where we'll leave it for this segment of Our State of Education, powered by the Skillman Foundation, investing in brighter futures for Detroit's youth and students across Michigan. We continue with more from Bethany Little next. Thanks for tuning in to Our State of Education on 760 WJR. Welcome back to Our State of Education, brought to you by the Skillman Foundation, which believes student, parent, and teacher voices must be at the table when decisions are being made about our schools. We're back with our guest, Bethany Little, Managing Principal at EducationCounsel. Once again, here's your host, Angelique Power.
Managing Principal, rock star, I don't know what's on your card, but so we were just talking, you know, when things are razzed to the ground, it is sort of the time to grow something different. What are the opportunities that we have this year?
You know, it's important to remember that none of us got into this business to protect the status quo in education. We believe in the need for change, radical, significant change in education. But also, you know, you have a house and it needs serious renovation, but you didn't need to set it on fire, is sort of the way we think about this right now. So this moment calls on us to be firefighters and architects. In this moment, it is actually deeply important to protect the civil rights infrastructure, to protect the data, to protect the research, to protect the funding streams, things that are very, very hard to get back. But we are not protecting everything. And some of the pieces that we're holding inequity in place, we are glad to let go of. And we want to think like architects in this moment. I may need to fight hard for that staircase that will make it possible to get to that second floor, but I may let go of the back porch. And that was not something that was serving us well. And so in that context, really specifically, what do we see as opportunities? You look at a state like Michigan that's really focused in on literacy and knows that literacy, the ability of every student to be able to read and enter into the fullness of their civic and employment and other opportunities requires that strong literacy. This administration is also really focused on literacy and the science of reading, and they've put new grants out related to literacy. So this may be a moment where we can make some progress together by focusing on that science of reading, focusing on what works, making big strides in literacy. Another example is this is a time when people are coming together to say, in our state, we care about the ability of all students to access education. And if the Department of Education isn't going to protect it, we'll create our own civil rights laws. We'll create our own civil rights enforcement units that can go out and do that work for us. In addition, this is a moment when the entire education system is in its state of change related to AI. Artificial intelligence is here to stay. And how do we think about building forward in new ways that leapfrog some of the problems we had and ensure things like we not only close the digital divide, we move into a place where students are accessing entirely new approaches and opportunities for education using AI, not as a crutch, not as a substitute for learning, but as a way to accelerate their learning and to enter into a new age of literacy that isn't just reading or isn't just numeracy, but is really digital and other forms of literacy as well. There are many opportunities ahead for us.
You know, EdCounsel has this opportunity to see what's happening from a bird's eye view because you work inside of so many states at the state level on policy. So can you give us the advantage of that perspective by telling us, like, what are some of the best things out there, the best practices that are working, and what are some of the things that we should like look out for that that aren't actually working so well?
Yeah, I'm going to start with that latter piece about what's not working well. And I'll say it's really the places that are over-rotating based on the actions of this administration that are in many ways pre-complying. They're afraid something's going to happen. And so they stop doing things that are particularly focused on the best interests and needs of our marginalized students. They know that this administration has been very upfront about its concerns around things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they are responding in ways that treat actions to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in education as though they are illegal. This administration cannot make diversity, equity, inclusion, actions to support marginalized students illegal. They can go after folks and they can prosecute folks, but it's important to know they have not won a single substantive case in the courts when they have tried to do that, because it's not illegal. And yet we have places around the country where people are stopping current important actions that they would have been taking. For example, institutions of higher education going out and recruiting purposely into our most diverse schools, into our schools that educate low-income students. That is still fully legal, and yet people are not doing that anymore. Or we had a case in Alabama this week where they stopped allowing people on campus to publish magazines and other publications that are designed to support particular students' cultural perspectives. That is not illegal, and they should not stop those students from exercising their First Amendment rights. So this sort of over-rotation and pre-compliance, I think, is the worst of what we're seeing happen in places. Also related to that, people who are pulling back data collections. Another thing, this administration in many ways, I think, is working to blind us to the reality of what's happening in education. And we should not go backwards in that regard. Where we have created light, where we have created knowledge, we need to keep moving forward. And to that end, on how is there opportunity, I do think some of the best practices in the country are places where states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Maryland are going hard into the science of reading and really taking on smart, research-informed literacy initiatives. And Michigan's got a strong start in that regard. And that's a place where Michigan can really take a big lead, and by following some of those best practices and things that we know work. The other is areas like attendance. People are making really significant efforts to make sure that we are getting kids back to school. We cannot let them fall prey to sort of the temptations not to attend. When you don't attend, you cannot learn. Everything else is secondary to showing up. Another area we're seeing a lot of best practices are places where people are going after support for students in the area of social media and access to online support. What we're learning is students are just overexposed to social media, overexposed to their phones. And so many states are really taking on best practices and saying, we need to be tighter and clearer about the supports and protections for our students that keep them from being sucked down these rabbit holes of AI, social media, and keep them focused on their real lives, their lives with their peers and with their teachers.
So it's tea leaf reading time. We are in December of 2026. We're looking back. What is the story that we will have told about this year?
Yeah, I think there's 4 big things that may come into play this year, right? One of those big things is around the next legislative cycle. That's right now, right? Where we are in the state legislature, and what's going to happen with the budget. The federal government passed this One Big Beautiful Bill Act that really created some hard demands in the areas of Medicaid, for example, or SNAP, food assistance, for example, demands on the state budget that were not there before. So this legislative session right now, and what we choose to do for Michigan's children, how we avoid pitting our needs against one another. Children need food and healthcare and education. We cannot fall prey to that. And so a year from now, I hope we're looking back and saying, we stood up for Michigan's children and we made sure that we met all of their needs. Another big moment ahead of us is this question we were talking about earlier related to social media and AI. How are we moving forward to protect our children, to ensure that their mental health, their social engagement, even their learning is protected, that they authentically engage with knowledge and content and build skills and aren't somehow just letting the AI do the work for them? This is a big set of decisions in front of us. A third one is that there's the implementation of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act tax credit related to vouchers. And that's going to be implemented in 2027. But the decisions we are making in this year of 2026 are critical to who will benefit. What we've seen over and over again in states that have these kinds of tax credits or education savings accounts is that it is always the wealthiest, most advantaged students that benefit first and foremost. And so we have to really work against that in Michigan to make sure that all students can benefit. We don't want to hold back our wealthier advantaged students, but we absolutely want to create more opportunity for the students who are not getting that opportunity now. How we attempt to make sure that this tax credit is given to the students who are in public schools, who might need an after-school program or a summer school program or additional tutoring or equipment, computer equipment to deal with that digital divide. Those are all things that could be done if Michigan chooses to take up this tax credit. But if it's not done carefully, The big risk is that this will simply put some students further behind and advantage the haves far more than the have-nots. And that's a big decision for Michigan to make this year. If they're going to take it on, and if so, how they're going to take it on, this tax credit, this voucher situation. And then the last thing I'll mention is that you spoke earlier about the importance of our history and how we note our history. This year is the 250th anniversary, and this administration has launched its History Rocks Tour. They have an America 250 Civics Ed Coalition that they are using to define America's history. There will be a fight for the definition of America's history, and defining our history is part of how we define our future. So this is going to be an important fight for Michigan's students and leaders and teachers and parents to get in on.
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you for helping to inform the story we tell about our democracy and our education, our year 2025, and here's to looking at 2026 and what might come from it.
That brings us to an end to this conversation with Bethany Little, Managing Principal at EducationCounsel. Next, we'll hear from the Chief Policy Officer at the Council of Michigan Foundations, Regina Bell. So don't go anywhere. There's much more ahead on Our State of Education, brought to you by the Skillman Foundation on 760 WJR. Welcome back to Our State of Education, proudly supported by the Skillman Foundation, partnering with people to transform education and nurture the brilliance and power of Detroit youth. We're continuing with another important conversation. Angelique, introduce our guest and take us back in.
Thank you, Lloyd. We just heard from Bethany Little of EducationCounsel, who described some significant shifts happening in education at the federal level and how they impact Michigan and its children. She mentioned real challenges that we have to grapple with, and also opportunities that we have to strengthen the way that we prepare young people across the state. And speaking of the state government has a lot of authority over education because states are constitutionally responsible for providing a public education system. That's in addition for being responsible for numerous other social systems and statewide infrastructure. The policies, laws, and budgets enacted by state leaders significantly impact our lives in so many ways. And often it's unseen, but it is never unfelt. There's a phrase for people who know the ins and outs of policy. That is, we call them policy wonks. And they get this name because the process by which policies are developed and debated and passed and implemented is so very complex. And someone who gets it, we like to call them a wonk. But every citizen has the right, and some would say the responsibility, to push for policies that they care about and push back against those that may create harm. How to do this isn't always clear. It isn't always made easy, but it is the heart of what we do at the Skillman Foundation. We believe that students and parents and teachers and community members know that their voices matter. And if they don't know, we want them to know, and we want to show them how they can inject themselves into making sure that education system leaders and policymakers know the reality of the policies they're creating so that they're more effective. So my next guest is a treasure trove of knowledge about public policy in Michigan. You'll let us know if we can call you a wonk, and works to ensure citizen voice drives it. Regina Bell is also a treasure to me and to so many of us here because she helps illuminate the complexity that happens in policy waters all the time. Welcome to Our State of Education, Regina Bell.
Thank you so much, Angelique. I really appreciate it.
So you are the Chief Policy Officer at the Council of Michigan Foundations. This is a membership organization that supports more than 230 Michigan foundations. For our folks listening, foundations are charitable organizations like Skillman that provide grants to other nonprofits. We help the helpers. We are cash registers with a conscience. We invest our dollars back into communities looking for a return on quality of life for our neighbors. That's it. Point blank, that's what we do. And foundations usually have some focus at Skillman, it's education and youth. Some run programs also that help carry out their mission. The Council of Michigan Foundation brings funders together to collaborate and learn and help organizations understand policies. That's where Regina comes in. You have over 20 years of experience working on these issues. So before we get into reflections and predictions, what sparked your passion for policy and what keeps it alive?
Yes, so I really appreciate this question because I think it's really grounded in my grandparents. So my grandparents on both sides really shared with me and demonstrated through action that civic and community engagement is not a spectator sport. My paternal grandfather was the first person of color to serve in local elected office in a very rural town in Georgia. And I have this great picture of my maternal grandparents when they actually were courting, and they were in Paradise Valley in one of the great jazz clubs in Paradise Valley. And you think about like even the history of Paradise Valley and urban renewal that destroyed that neighborhood, it was because of public policy. So it's really my ancestors and bringing them along in conversations around policy that keeps me motivated.
Oh, I never knew that story. That's so cool. I love that. So you come by this honestly. I wanna look back a little bit on everything that's happened. Earlier in the show, we talked with Bethany about the federal policy shifts that impact local schools and school children. You've been working in the nonprofit sector, so you have seen how cuts to federal funding have impacted local nonprofits, while at the same time, cuts to federal programs have made the need for nonprofits just like go through the roof. You have a view on these key issues about how philanthropic and nonprofit sectors are trying to fill the gaps of the changes. What are some of the biggest issues that you have seen coming at Michigan communities in 2025?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when I think about the state of education, I think kind of the headline for Michigan is that we've taken some important steps to invest in students and create a fair funding system, but more really needs to be done along the P20 continuum to ensure student success. And I think that foundations have leaned in a great way, working in partnership with nonprofits. And nonprofits have served as great advocates as we think about some of the key provisions that were included in the fiscal year 2026 budget. So, we saw a 4.6 increase in the per pupil funding allowance. We also saw more resources delivered for the Opportunity Index. We also saw an increase in investment for at-risk students, English language learners, and a continuation of free breakfast and lunch program for Michigan's 1.4 million students. More funding for literacy supports and critical investments as well in school safety and student mental health. But we also saw a decline in third grade reading proficiency. We know that some of the students have not necessarily matriculated through the system to really feel the impacts of some of these additional investments, but we need to be investing more in education and certainly on the early childhood because along the P20 continuum, your experiences at a young age impact your matriculation through K through 12 system as well as post-secondary.
So, in our last segment, a big part of what we talked about was this sort of bulldozing that's happening from the federal level of the Department of Education and of, civil rights infrastructure. But what you just talked about, Regina, was that Michigan actually did something like kind of surprising in response. By all intents and purposes, the last state budget was an education budget. So all of the things that you mentioned, the highest per pupil allowance, we did not, take money out of public education and privatize it. We did invest. There are no punishments that are going out right now for practicing DEI in schools. Why did that happen here? Why do you think Michigan's different?
Yeah, so I think a couple of reasons. I do think because of the advocacy power of nonprofit partners. That really was critically important. Uh, Being able to hear from students, being able to hear from educators around the importance of these things. But I also think that there's a recognition among some of our policymakers that in order for us to have a quality education system, these things need to be in place. And so I hope that that continues to be a through line as we think about budget negotiations for fiscal year 2027.
I think about that too, especially the piece where 9 out of 10 Michigan children attend public schools. And so some of those pieces around even like vouchers for private schools, well, especially in rural areas, there really aren't spaces for private schools where a lot of students can be accepted there. So I think public education is just the go-to for so many here. We're going to come back talking about 2026 shortly, but I'm going to turn it back to you, Lloyd.
A lot of ground has been covered with our guests, but there's still more to unpack with Regina Bell, Chief Policy Officer at the Council of Michigan Foundations, in our final segment right after this break. You're listening to Our State of Education, brought to you by the Skillman Foundation on 760 WJR. Welcome back to Our State of Education, sponsored by the Skillman Foundation, where we follow the will of Detroit youth to dream big and design new possibilities together. Angelique, let's turn it back over to you to reintroduce our guest.
I am here with Regina Bell, Chief Policy Officer from the Council of Michigan Foundations. We're having a great conversation about all the things that have changed in 2025 and kind of the uniqueness of Michigan in how we are responding to those changes. Let's talk 2026. There are a lot of changes on the horizon simply through the new leaders that we have stepping up to take the mantle of work. We have a new state superintendent, Glenn Maleko. In Detroit, we have a new mayor, Mary Sheffield. She just started her work and takes the office on the heels of Mike Duggan, who ran the city for 12 years. We will, in November of this year, be casting ballots for a new governor. All of this plays such a big role on education. Regina, when you think about what this means for public policy, what it means to people like you who advocate for change, what does this new leadership pretend?
Yeah, so I really think that these changes represent an opportunity. It's an opportunity to lift up data and research. It's an opportunity to share stories of policy impact on children and families. And it's also an opportunity, though, to listen, because many of these incoming lawmakers will have. Ideas and thoughts about the strategic direction for the state of education and other key policy areas. So it's important that we share our stories. It's important that we share research. It's important that we share data, but it's also important that we listen. The other thing I'll just mention quickly, Angelique, is that, Proposal 1 of 2022 really amended term limits here in the state to allow House and Senate members to serve a total of 12 years in either chamber. And so this will be the first time that we will see kind of the impacts of that. And we've got a number of state House members that will be running for the state Senate. So again, it is an opportunity for education and it's an opportunity for deepening relationships with policymakers.
Hmm. Let's talk about young people for a minute. We've been talking about sort of the uniqueness of Michigan, and the partnership with youth is actually something that makes Michigan pretty unique. Could you talk to us about, first of all, just that? What happened 30 some years ago with the Kellogg Foundation that set a lot of this in motion?
Yeah, so the Council of Michigan Foundations has really been a national leader in engaging and developing the skills and voices of youth philanthropy within communities, and that could not have been possible without seed funding from the Kellogg Foundation that really helped community foundations develop their youth advisory councils. And those youth advisory councils are responsible for helping to make grant decisions within their communities. Across Michigan, there are about 1,500 young people that serve on 86 youth grant-making committees. And really, they're comprised of youth members ages 12 to 21. And in total, there has been $43.8 million in grant funding that's been given by YACS in Michigan to nonprofits across the state since 1989. So I really think about young people, and this opportunity as helping to define the future of philanthropy, but also helping to define the future of civil society. And so it's really, that engagement is incredibly important.
At Skillman, we have 2 young people on our board. We have Skillman Youth Advisory, the YAC, as you called it, the Youth Advisory Council, who give away about $250,000 annually. And even more than that, I feel like they teach us how to think about this work and this world in totally different ways. We really learn from them as much as we try to offer to them. So, on a final note, and I know we've caught you while you are stepping out of meetings, you are in Lansing, doing what you do best. So I just want you to read the tea leaves for us for a moment. What do you think is on the horizon for us in 2026?
Yeah, so certainly the budget, right? So engaging in budget negotiations for fiscal year 2027. We are seeing, as a result of HR 1, which some refer to as one big beautiful bill, the implications of what it will mean for the state of Michigan. And some of those implementation provisions will require that the state kick in additional resources. I think we are also going to see, beginning December 2026, Medicaid enrollees are going to see some significant changes. And so I think that there is an opportunity for nonprofits and philanthropy to really engage as we think about navigators and helping families. And really, it's important for young people because, if you're not healthy, it's hard to learn, right? So all of these things in my mind are really connected. And then, we will also see implementation of the RX Kids. So in the fiscal year 2026 budget, there was funding to allow for this cash subscription to pregnant women and through the first year of the child's life. And so we will see the implementation of those pieces in 2026. So I also think that housing will be an important issue. Again, I think that all of these things are related as we think about health, the well-being of children and families across the state.
And the Detroit Lions?
Oh my goodness, I hope they go all the way.
That's the prediction, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, Regina. I know that you got to get back to what you're doing. I just want to again mention the Council of Michigan Foundations and the work that you do there to ensure that every neighborhood and all of the nonprofits across the state of Michigan are really well taken care of. We appreciate you and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Wow, what great conversations we had today with Bethany and with Regina. I have been reading an old book that was recently re-released. It's called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. She is a writer and a historian, an author of 13 books about art and landscape, community, ecology, politics, hope, and memory. And she talks about how there's darkness, but it isn't always negative. Often it's just not knowing what's ahead. If we look throughout history, so much progress has been made. Who would have imagined in 250 years we would build a nation where we can insist public systems work for all people, even if we haven't achieved this yet? That we can vote freely, that we can transfer power peacefully, We can have differences and build common ground and keep fighting for the country we know we can be. In this book, she says, and I'm quoting her now, cause and effect assumes history marches forward. But history's not an army. It's a crab scuttling sideways, a drip of soft water wearing away stone, an earthquake breaking centuries of tension. Sometimes one person inspires a movement, or their words do decades later. Sometimes a few passionate people change the world. Sometimes they start a mass movement and millions do. Sometimes those millions are stirred by the same outrage or the same ideal, and change comes upon us like a change of weather. All that these transformations have in common is that they begin in the imagination, in hope. To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty are better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. Here's to the year ahead, in the country and in Michigan. Here's hoping it brings us all the things that we need and desire, especially for our children. Here's to 2026.
We appreciate you joining us today. Happy New Year, and we'll see you next month with more voices, more insight, more hope for the future of Michigan students on our State of Education, only on 760 WJR.